Good morning. Actually, wait, look. Pick him up. Kitty. But yeah. Oh,
Good morning.
morning, Dr. G.
How are you?
Good, how are you?
I'm
Oh,
okay.
my cat just almost just fell off of the chair, so I'm like, clumsy pets here. I'm just
Yeah,
trying to make breakfast. I don't know. I'm hungry.
understood.
Let's see. You're the one who fell off the chair.
Aw,
Mhm.
adorable.
Bye, Bakugo. Have fun.
Where's the coffee, Dr. G?
Coffee's right here.
Mine's still brewing.
Oh man, I didn't want to wake up today. I don't know what's going on. If it's just, I don't know, just being tired or something.
I made the mistake
Something.
yesterday of going to a conference for work and not making coffee in the morning.
Yikes.
So I
Oof.
didn't drink coffee till like 5 and I was exhausted.
Dang.
But I'm not gonna do that this morning. I'm gonna make myself a cup of coffee because
Yeah.
that was not a good idea.
It's first thing I do after, I wake up and go to the bathroom, do my, duties, get dressed and stuff, and then I go straight to the coffee pot. I'm like, oh my God.
I'm gonna make it in my cat mom cup.
Oh, that's cute.
Usually
Yeah.
my wife will wake up for work before me, so the coffee will be made when I get up, but today was her day off. So we
Ah.
both were super lazy and stayed in bed until about minutes ago.
Oh, I wanted to so bad. I must have hit my snooze button 4 or 5 times, you know. So I woke up a little bit later than I normally would. So I'm still, like I said, I'm still trying to wake up myself. Most people are, let's see. Mel, you said yeah, you had to drag yourself out of bed. Yeah. I get it. I totally understand. Okay, looks like we have a good 20 people here. All right.
Copy.
Yes, coffee, coffee, coffee. Mhm. I'm trying to see if
I wouldn't be
Michael.
surprised if my mic and camera go on and off because I have cats stepping on my
Hello
computer.
there. I'm here.
That's
So
fine.
just
I'm
letting you be aware.
I'm looking for Michael W. So,
I'm here. Can y'all hear me?
oh, there you are. It's a blue screen. Yeah, I can hear
Oh.
you.
Yeah.
There you are. Awesome. I don't know if you got my email this morning.
No, I guess I should check that.
Yeah. Okay. I started grading exercises this morning. I still have a ways to go, but I've graded some. And I just want to, I'm going to offer a quick clarification about the content that you read. It seems like there was a little confusion about that. So I just wanted to verify or clarify, I should say. So let me just mention this, that when Benjamin Franklin wrote these letters, I think I said to someone in your response, he was like 13 or 14. He was actually 16 years old. So he was still a young boy, uh, working for his brother. His brother is the one that developed the New England Current, the newspaper. And Benjamin had asked him many times if he could publish in the paper, and his brother always denied him. So he decided, I'm guessing, I don't know, only Benjamin knows. I'm guessing that he um, not only wanted to have content published in his brother's newspaper, but he wanted to make clear some of the beliefs that he had. And so he did that by creating this character named Silence Dogood, who was considered a woman. Benjamin Franklin's the one 16-year-old boy is writing these letters as a middle-aged woman. And so all the letters are written from her, I'm putting her in quotation marks, her perspective about particular subjects, marriage, companionship, education, certain topics like that. So, oh yes, Mel, his brother was livid. Benjamin had to flee the city because his brother was so angry, and he had to flee the city to avoid his brother's wrath. And then, of course, we learn later on in the background that not too long later, he does create his own newspaper. And from there it goes on, but his initial publishing was in his brother's newspaper. His brother was eating it up because so much of the audience, the people were loving what Silence had to say. And there were some men who actually wrote letters of proposal to Silence Dogood. And so some of you were saying it's like it was a joke. He was, kind of poking fun. I agree with that. The fact that, you know, she is revered for what she had submitted to the paper, when in fact it was actually Benjamin writing the entire time. He fooled his brother, he fooled the entire community about what, you know, he was offering. So I wanted to offer that at least clarification, because yes, Benjamin wrote the letters, but he wrote it as a female. And so the content that's provided in the letters is from Silence's perspective, from a female's perspective. So I just want to make sure that that was I think Marquis, you said he definitely felt a way about it. Yeah, he catfished them.
Oh yeah, I was responding to Mel's comment. Because she
Oh.
asked do you think his brother was mad to find out. So yeah, that was just response to her.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, his brother was quite angry. I mean, very, very angry. I've not seen Bridgerton. Is that what it's called? Bridgerton. So I am not familiar with the reference that you make. That's a direct allusion, by the way. Just mentioning that. So while we're looking through this, Michael is going to conduct the discussion today. And while we're looking through this, you submitted an illusions research exercise this morning. And so I will, you know, kind of point out some of them. Some of them are very obvious, but some of them are a little bit more obscure. But there are direct references within the first 5 letters. You were responsible for reading the first 5 letters and then locating allusions from within those. So I just wanted to make sure, like I said, that everybody understands where this material is coming from whose perspective. Okay, Michael, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. And when I have something to say, I'll raise my hand.
All right. Well, y'all, I'll be leading this discussion today. Unfortunately, my partner could not make it today, so I'll be running both of them. I'll try to go back and forth, though that may mean it might be more one or the other, as opposed to having one person doing the speaking while the other one runs the chat. I'll
Just
have to
plan,
switch back and
Michael,
forth.
plan on doing the verbal. And if you see something in the chat you want to address verbally, that's fine. But I'm not going to fault you for not being able to respond to everything in the chat.
No, yeah, I meant more to say if you say I figured I'd check the chat while other people are speaking.
Oh, okay, great.
So to start with the first question, actually building off what you were just talking about of him writing as a woman and specifically as a widowed middle-aged woman with children who had come from this background, the specific background of being raised up by a church person and having been well educated in that. Like how might he have come about that, and how might his specific interests that he wished to pursue in this newspaper have influenced his decision to take upon this persona? Does anyone have any interesting thoughts about that? Why he might choose to pose as a middle-aged widow? I see a Michael Boyd.
Yeah, I think, well, if he had been honest and said, okay, you know, I'm a 16-year-old kid, he wouldn't have been as credible, maybe, you know, and so that's one possibility. He was like really imaginative, right? And he was very, very good at writing too. So maybe it was a way, and I don't know, you know, that's a really good question, because there's no really, I don't know anything about the possible answer, but so I'm just speculating that, you know, he was imaginative, and he I think he just what was I going to say, that he wrote it with this other voice, I don't know, because he could, I mean, because I think would have more freedom in expressing like or ideas and things like that. I thought I'm in the group that thinks that he did it. He was kind of tricking the audience, into thinking, and I think that was intentional. That he was it was probably funny to him, in a way that he was making the audience think that it was a person that that didn't actually exist. And so maybe there was some entertainment value there for him. But I think it was just a way. I think it was just, I don't know, that he was that was just a way for him to like exercise like his imagination, and he just gave him just made it possible for him to just like talk to the public in a certain way. So I don't know if
There
that makes
certainly
any
is
sense.
a strong sense of that. I couldn't help but when I was reading it to read it in the voice of like a sassy Southern belle, like, "Sir, it may be inappropriate in the first place that I tender, but I will not.
Yeah.
I will not." There was some great parts of it in it, of the descriptions of it, that I got quite a kick out of reading in that manner. But yeah,
Yeah.
that certainly could be part of it, that desire to express himself creatively, as well as to build legitimacy, which he does say in the first one, that people would like to know the circumstances that surround these ideas. And that's kind of one of the
Right.
things that made me ask this question, is the idea that he had a specific set of ideas he wanted to espouse, and he found this persona to be useful for some reason or another. I see, Brandon, you've got your hand up as well.
Yeah, a lot of what I'm going to say is going to be adding on to what Michael said. Ben Franklin was known to be an intellectual, have quick wit, and be pretty humorous. And I don't think the word troll is appropriate, because trolling kind of involves some sort of malicious intent. I don't think it was malicious, but I think that this was kind of one of his ways, just not only to get his ideas out, but to, mess with people a little bit. I think that he probably had a lot of fun knowing that these letters were messing with people in a certain way. A friend of mine were discussing these letters yesterday, and he brought up a really good point where it's almost similar to the internet today, where you have this name, this alias that you go by. Nobody knows who you are. You're completely anonymous. It gives you a forum to say and do whatever you want. Not that you should, but you can. And I kind of equated, the silence do good letters back then to maybe somebody talking on an internet forum today under an alias. And I thought that was kind of a good point that my buddy brought up.
That's an interesting thing of it. Yeah, I did think of that as well. There certainly is. It's interesting reading them, knowing that. Like, knowing that he isn't this woman and that he is writing in this voice, that gives them a level of, when you're reading them, knowing that there's a level of playfulness that sticks out a lot more obviously because of that. One thing to keep in mind, though, about the ideas of it being trolling is that in a certain way he is trolling, but what's really different is, in modern internet culture, the idea of trolling as being something extremely frivolous, because in the modern internet, the cost of posting is incredibly low, and there's such a high volume that trolling is something where, you can go anywhere and you can throw out a couple of posts that don't really mean anything, and it's such a light thing. But in this, this is the colonial publishing days, so there's probably the same element of messing with people, but there's a much more serious element of, this is a newspaper that we're printing in the olden days, not just something we're posting on a forum. I see, Melanie, you have your hand up.
Yes. Okay, so I was thinking that taking on a woman's voice may have made it a little bit easier for him to get some of his more what is the word? Like, I'll just say off kilter because I can't not think right now, but maybe his more like controversial ideas. Like maybe maybe he thought that certainly as a young man he's not going to be taken seriously. But also that a woman who's lived a life I mean, women aren't going to be taken especially seriously. So maybe he thought he could get some of these ideas passed. And like, you know, it's in a woman's voice, so people are going to take it as harshly. They're not going to take it as like maybe a direct criticism as if a 16-year-old boy was writing about Harvard. They would be like, well, I mean, you're uneducated and, you know, da 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 da. But here, he's created a character that has this whole life experience and this whole like trajectory, and obviously is extremely intelligent and like basically made a space for himself through silence. I feel like a little bit, and I feel like the taking on a woman's voice was like maybe feeling like he could approach from a lower rung in society and still kind of get his message out there, and in a less like, I mean, it was obviously still like explosive and like people talked about it, but I don't know, maybe the woman's voice made it something that he felt a little more like, I can get these crazy ideas out and people will take them as more as a novelty than as a direct attack.
I think that's a very interesting thought of it. I definitely think there is an intentional aspect of the gender norms of the day in using a voice like hers. And there is something, her name is Dogood. So obviously the idea of her as being like the silence do-good of the kind of a conscience in the newspaper, writing about moral issues of vice and virtue. There's a certain element of being within the very masculine culture of the time of being chastised by a woman might be considered to be especially embarrassing if it is in fact his purpose to push these moral ideas, like the idea that you are not just being criticized by some other man who you can just like blow off or get into a shouting argument, but that you're being judged by a woman, and a woman who is proving to be highly intelligent, more intelligent than would be expected of a woman of the times. So you could think of leveraging the gender norms on both sides by pretending to be a woman. His intelligence is instantly boosted because now he's not just whatever level of his intelligence as a man, as a woman having lower expectations, he would be all the more spectacular. And also as a force of being chastising someone, it's like an insult coming from, it's a woman's judgment being harsher than that of a man's and being more critical of men in that way. I also thought in seeing some of the letters they wrote back to him, there might be a sense that if it was a man, if he was presenting himself as a man, people might just kind of argue or blow him off. But by presenting himself as a woman, he invites the people that write back, like the guy he responds to in the fifth one, to think better of themselves, like to think of themselves in a position to, rather than dissuade this, to correct this, like, oh, this is a woman, if I disagree with her, instead of just saying, oh, this person's, you know, full of it, to be like, oh, well, you were mistaken in this way. And it kind of begets a form of engagement you might not get if you were just acting as a man. I see some comments in the chat here. I don't see anyone with their hand up. I feel like Franklin chose, this is from Justin. I feel like Franklin chose to make silence do-good a woman with children, especially to give his critique of the educational system more credibility. That's certainly true. The idea that as a woman, she would have an insight, not just an insight, but a stake. She would be a stakeholder in the education of children as a mother herself. That would certainly lend credence to her thing.
Which is ironic because he didn't have a very extensive education. Benjamin Franklin, I mean, right?
Well, clearly he was very well read at the time, but yeah, that's another thing of it. It's funny thinking back of, people do say all the time, like, oh, like no 16-year-old knows anything. But Benjamin Franklin, of course, being an exceptional individual, is one of the examples of someone who was wise beyond his years. And
absolutely.
Even though he was just 16, he did manage to make some things that were really quite insightful.
Ben Franklin was really critical of higher education in general and its importance to society or success. Dr. G saw I wrote about this in my Illusions, and that was actually kind of neat and enlightening, realizing how proud he was of his blue collar roots and how much he would stand up to the notion that, you know, you cannot succeed without higher education. I thought that was pretty cool.
He
And
talked
yet
about
at the same time, he's very much, there's a duality of it, because at the same time that he might stand against the formal systems of education, he is undoubtedly espousing the value of education and of learning as a valuable asset. He speaks of it within his character of having been well learned. And if I could see if I could find some of these quotes in here. But he says that his benefactor had an excellent library, which allowed them to make use of all of the necessary.
I don't remember the
Free use of the
exact quote,
library.
but he said, you know, the importance of education is dependent on the individual themselves. Basically saying, like, you know, higher education is not an end all be all that you should slap on every single person. We're all unique. We all learn differently. We all have different sets of skills.
Yeah, I see Alexandria has your hand up.
Yeah, I think just thinking about who Ben Franklin became, it was like it's there's sometimes where I'm like, oh yeah, well maybe he did like writing that much, but again, he was one of the founding fathers, so obviously he had to like, warm up to some kind of writing eventually when he gets older. But like I think he had a different view of like from other people. I think he definitely was ahead of his time. He was in his own little world. He saw what others did not see, and at this time, that's something that not everybody wanted. But he definitely did see the world in a different place, and I think him pretending to be a woman gave himself another view because obviously he's not a woman. But like when he does put that kind of, I guess like vision in his mind of like what it would be like to be a woman in his time, that changes his whole perspective because at that time, men usually were shown to have it like all, but women had to work with things and they didn't have as many rights as men did. And so just like seeing like what it would be like to go through life as a woman at that time, it must have been really eye-opening for him to understand like, oh, wait, this is what actually is going on. But also I think it was in a playful way that he wanted to like trick people because it definitely seemed like, yeah, it just seemed like something he would do. Just like play with people and some little brains and be like, "Oh, I'm gonna trick people into thinking I'm a woman, but I'm actually not." So I think it's interesting, and I think it one thing that always cuts me off guard with all these writings that are from the old time is the way that things are spelled differently. There was one word that's lived, and it was L-I-V, and then the comma or not comma, what's it called?
Apostrophe.
Yeah, apostrophe, and then it was a D. And then I was like, huh. I was like, that's not something that you see now in these days. And it's like, wow. So I mean, I think it was definitely a unique person. And but I think it gave him a different view. And I don't think people would have listened to him if he just like automatically said, this is what a woman's life would be like if he didn't pretend.
Yeah, it is interesting. He says he does even come out, I guess calling them feminist might not be appropriate given the time period, but he does certainly come out in his fifth letter to speak about the women's work never being done and the ways in which they are often underappreciated. So it seems like even in his youth and in his inexperience as a man, he had empathy and understanding for the struggles that women go through and the lack of appreciation that they get. I see Julio.
Yeah, I was just tagging on to what Alexandria was saying is that he, I think that's also why he chose to be a woman, is because it was so scandalous and taboo. I think he wanted to cater to both sides, while at the same time getting as many clicks, if you will, you know?
Yeah, I could see that as a matter of popularity. I've never seen, I know there is a movie. I know through cultural osmosis. I don't think I've ever seen it. I think it was called like Gossip Girl or something. It was some
Oh, yeah,
movie
yeah,
or
yeah, yeah.
TV show about, yeah, someone had like a secret gossip blog. I just imagine him, I imagine that is Benjamin Franklin of his, this is his scandalous gossip blog.
Yeah, that what was her name?
I see Michael has your hand up.
Yeah, just to expand on what Brandon mentioned earlier about his criticism of higher education, in the fourth letter, he says something in like the end, he says something, and it's, I'm going to have to paraphrase here, but he says something like, after, you know, parents have spent all this money sending their kids to school and going through all this trouble and charge the money, they're just, their kids come back basically as great blockheads that are only more proud and self-conceited, you know. And so yeah, and so that was his way of you know, poking at the education system. And so yeah, I don't know, I'm not sure. Yeah, so he didn't have like really high regard for it in some ways.
Michael, I
Here,
love that line. That I think it was something along the lines of
I've got it.
they come
I've
out
got it
just
right
as
in here.
ignorant as they went in.
Now I bethought myself in sleep that it was time to be home, and as I fancied I was traveling back thither, I reflected in my mind on the extreme folly of those parents who, blind to their children's dullness and insensibility of the solidarity of their skulls, because they think their purses can afford it, will needs send them to the temple of learning, where, for want of a suitable genius, they will learn little more than how to carry themselves handsomely and enter a room gently, which they might as well acquire at a dancing school, and from whence they return after abundance of trouble and charge, as great blockheads as ever, only more proud and self-conceited.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yes, it certainly is a great one. Let's talk more about that. I think we should focus in on the fourth letter for right now. I think it's the one, the first three are primarily introductory. The fourth one definitely has the most substance in terms of his political implications and his outright critiques of the virtues and vices of the society. So to start with, one of the things when I was doing my research on the illusions was looking into the colleges of the time, of when he says bring them up at our college in reference to Harvard. It's very, I looked it up, there actually at the time there were only 3 colleges in all of the 13 colonies at the time that this was written. So there would have been Harvard in Boston, there would have been something in Mary's, I have it somewhere around here, the College of William and Mary in Virginia, and then Yale would have just opened up in Connecticut. So when he says our college, it's very clear that it would have been very clear to anyone who was reading the magazine living in Boston that he would be referring to Harvard. Let's see here for a second.
What paragraph are you talking about there, Michael?
I'm looking at the first paragraph of the fourth letter, when he says, I asked advice about my young son William, whether or not I had best bestow upon him academical learning, or, as our phrase is, bring him up at our college. So I believe he or she is saying in this whether or no I had best bestow, as in whether I, as his mother, should teach him these things, or, as our phrase is, bring him up at our college, which would be to send him off to the school of obviously to Harvard. That would be what she's supposedly speaking with her local clerical
Schools,
figure,
right.
clericus. I like that he does that with all of the names, giving them such clear meaning of, he is the clerical guy, his name's Clericus. I'm the silent do-gooder. I'm Mrs. Do-good. But he says these words Clericus gave me, or he says that the Clericus brings up that he will not idle away his time as too many there nowadays do. And that seems to be the central focus of this, of idling away their time, and of the idea that education, it seems certainly to say that you have the opportunity to educate yourself, even if all you have is books, that you may go out and exercise your mind and gain this education. But it is through the exercise of your mind that you do gain this education, and you will not simply gather it by standing in the halls idly of the institutions, even of Harvard. Does anyone have any thoughts on the other criticisms he gave of Harvard in this?
Well, I just think it's in a way ironic that here we are in a college class talking about him. and in a way he was like, hey, you don't need school, you can just like teach yourself, you know. And so it's kind of ironic.
It is kind of ironic. I fell into that, you know, I can teach myself. I don't need a degree role for so long in my life. And it wasn't until recently when I was applying for, Michael, you'll appreciate this, software jobs. And I realized how brutal the market is. I was like, okay, you know, maybe I do need to go back to school and get a piece of paper. And, you know, I am learning a lot here. I learn a lot on my own. I think there's a lot to be said to both of them. And again, it comes back to, it depends on the individual if you need higher education or not. If I had been applying for software jobs 3 years ago, I wouldn't be here today. I wouldn't have needed a degree. But in 2022, 23, and 24, you absolutely do. So
Right. Yeah, it's really competitive.
I've always liked education. I've always liked writing. Obviously, I work at a school, so if that says as much. But I think definitely with them, like how they like teach themselves is like something that's like big, like wow. But also like their writings are so interesting. It's like I would love to see these in the newspapers. Their writings, that would be interesting to see instead of whatever else is in the newspapers. Because I'll be honest with you, I don't read the newspapers, but I feel like this would make it interesting.
Yeah,
But yeah.
it certainly would. And I think, well, here, first I'll call on Melanie.
Just going off the higher education thing and what Mel said in chat, I wanted to kind of go off of, because I wondered about this myself. She says he seemed to despise education, but he started his own school, and you know he was tearing Harvard a new one. I did wonder if it was a little bit of like outside looking in. You know what I mean? Like his life wasn't exactly silver spoons and all, like he's quick to, so I wondered, like, I mean, starting his own school, maybe he you know, well, obviously he had a lot of knowledge to impart. This is somebody we want to start a school. I mean, and I'm also thinking during chat, like, you know, how did he do this? Like at 16, like how, like, he's just such an extraordinary person, really, really. So it's giving me a lot to think about. But I just wanted to go off of what Mel said. Like you know, like I wonder if it was a little bit of like he was kept out of that. Maybe he wondered what he, you know, maybe he was 100% like I am who I am because of the lack of schooling I got, and because I didn't go to these like quote unquote finishing schools. Or maybe he thought, who would I be if I had gotten just a little more education? You know what I mean? Like, I mean, more education certainly doesn't hurt. But yeah, I wondered if that's why that's not why he started a school, because, you know, he resented the fact that he wasn't allowed to finish through that. And, you know, despite what anybody says about pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, at the end of the day, like, it would be much easier, and we would all probably appreciate having been born with like $1 billion in the bank. It would have just been a lot easier off the top. So I wondered if he's not just thinking a little bit of that as well in some of his criticisms.
Well, he certainly does say, he says in one of his best quotes among the embodiments of various ideals, of the passage before the gates of the campus is kept by two sturdy porters named Riches and Poverty, and the latter obstinately refuses to give entrance to any who have not first gained the favor of the former. And I think that's interesting, going back to what Brandon said about being in college to get a justification for programming when in previous years you wouldn't have needed one, of the even in the early colonies there was this sense of gatekeeping of education and resources, gatekeeping of education and the resources that it brings behind this barrier. And it's interesting that specifically it's talking about Harvard, because this is a tradition that Harvard carries on very much into the modern day of being a hyper expensive, hyper exclusive school, which produces an enormous number of very affluent and very powerful people relative to its size. So it could be that even in the early days, Benjamin Franklin could see the potential dangers of such an institution and the potential for it to create new aristocracies, the likes of which they had back in England. One other thing he definitely speaks out against in opposition to this education is that of religion. He calls it the temple of theology, that most people, after leaving school, some of them took to various things, but by the most part of the crowd went along a large beaten path which led to a temple at the further end of the plain, called the Temple of Theology. The business of those who were employed in this temple being laborious and painful, I wondered exceedingly to see so many go towards it. But when I was pondering this matter in my mind, I spied pecunia, which is the Latin for money or the treasury, behind a curtain, beckoning to them with her hand, which sight immediately satisfied me for whose sake it was, that a great part of them, I will not say all, traveled that road. In this temple I saw nothing worth mentioning, except the ambitious and fraudulent contrivances of Plagius, who is obviously in reference to plagiarism, who, notwithstanding he has been severely reprehended for such practices before, was diligently transcribing some eloquent paragraph out of Tillotsen's works, and etc., to embellish his own. So what do y'all think this idea, what do you think he's saying about the church, its relationship to the college, and both the church and the college's relationship to education and the purpose of learning? Does anyone have any thoughts about that? I see Brandon.
Not specifically. I do know that Ben Franklin was against like dogmatic teachings in church, and lived more through um positive moral examples that he set rather than the teachings and preachings of church. I just wanted to add that in there because it definitely affected his view here. To say I could go any deeper than that, I'd be lying at the moment.
All right. Julio, I see your hands up.
Hey, yeah, I think he was just basically, I guess, talking about like the norm at the time, like, and we see it in all of our basically all of our previous readings, right, where everyone had gone to Harvard and then became a minister, right, to gain some sort of status, or like he says, people are in it for the wrong reasons. They're there for the money, and it's easy, and then embellishing these works and calling them their own. So
Yeah,
yeah, I
that's
mean, I think he's
definitely
just he's calling it out, the truth of it.
yeah, that's definitely a part of it. Going back to what Brandon was talking about of his speculation on religion, I looked into his religious views a little bit, and it does seem like there's some uncertainty, but from what it described, what the people that I read described, they spoke of him as being what they called a deist, which I was not familiar with, but they were saying was, I guess, a pretty big split within the religion at the time of the idea that before the anti-deist thing would be to say that God exists because the Bible says God exists, and that the value of this knowledge derives from its place in the Holy Scripture and basically comes from the authority of the church. But the deist position was more that God was the existence of God was self-evident and could be rationally determined by observing the world around you. That might definitely coincide with his value of education and his devaluing of the words of the church ministers. I see, Michael, you raised your hand again.
Yes, I was just going to remark on Tillotson's works. So that was one of the illusions that I researched, and what I learned about that was that that's a reference to John Tillotson, who was he was the Archbishop of the church of Canterbury.
Yes.
And yeah, and he had published like 254 of his sermons that was really highly respected and popular, and apparently people copied from them. And so I think so I think he's saying hey that maybe that was kind of like almost like it was okay for people to sort of borrow from his stuff because it was popular. Or I also read that some clergymen would use his sermons instead of like writing their own. They would just pass off his work as being theirs. So that's I just wanted to add that about what that reference is about. And but yeah, as far as like the relationship between the education and religion, that's a good question. Because yeah, like some ministers were really respected, and that was a respected profession. So it's almost like he's taken a little bit of a dig at it there in a way. But yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah, I think it also needs to come back to. I'd like to speak more on Tillerson in a little bit. I think he's got some other interesting bits in there that relate to this. But in his second letter introducing himself, when he concludes of their own character, he or she says, "Know then that I am an enemy of vice and a friend to virtue, that I am one of an extensive charity and a great forgiver of private injuries, a hearty lover of the clergy and all good men, and a mortal enemy to arbitrary government and unlimited power." So there's definitely a split in here of being a lover to the clergy, of I'm not positioning herself as not being opposed to the people. I'm not opposed to the I'm not opposed to your, John, your preacher. I know him. He's a good guy, but it's the organization of the church, which might be something which I do not subscribe to. Does anyone else have any thoughts about that, about how this might relate to this criticism of the church might relate to his criticism of arbitrary government and unlimited power? He also says, I'm naturally very jealous for the rights and liberties of my country. Does anyone have any thoughts on that in relation to the speaking of the church?
There's a quote in the Bible that says something like, wide is the path to destruction and narrow is the path to like God, and this did remind me of that quote about like the a large path, and all these people are going towards this school. I don't know, it just kind of reminded me of that quote, and I was wondering what he was trying to say there. But yeah, that's all.
I think that's interesting. I really, I'm definitely behind in my knowledge of Bible quotes. I know almost none of them, but they certainly do show up here. There's probably several in here that I'm missing just by not getting the connect. Does anyone else have any thoughts on that? Let me check the chat here for a second. Let's see. The ideas for reject the notion of divine intervention, rely on reason and study. Early U.S. history is coming in clutch. Collecting a check, yeah. Lighthouses are more helpful than churches. They provide a beam of light, but only in the direction it's pointing. That's an interesting quote. Well, if no one else does anyone else have anything to say about that? Because I've got something I'd like to bring up on it, but I want to make sure we get this part before we kind of pivot into that. If not, I'll just go ahead. So when I was looking into Tillotsen's works and trying to find out more about what they said, I came across someone who was writing an article speaking on another person who was comparing the two. It was called the Confucius of Europe, the Tillotsen of China. And he was talking about a writer who had connected these two writers. And I don't know if y'all know anything about Confucius and his beliefs. I also not super versed in them, but I'm a little bit familiar that Confucianism is very much based around order and hierarchy and the importance of maintaining one's position in the hierarchy, and that out of all of the duties you have, like the most important, the highest duty you have is to fulfill your position in the hierarchy and to do your duties dutifully and correctly. So in relation to that, the works of Tillotsen were very moderate. He was very much a moderate of like, you need to be moderate, you need to be conservative in your actions and in the way that you live. And he was very much against rebellion. He was specifically, let me see if I can find. Naturally, as here, Tillotsen was an unwavering advocate of obedience to the civil law and of the doctrine of non-resistance to those in authority. Naturally, as an advocate for the stabilizing power of government, Tillotsen, at least initially, disapproved of revolution because it upset the inherent social order. To a degree, both Confucius and Tillotsen encouraged the populace towards moderation, or perhaps more accurately, towards complacency. So my meaning in bringing this up is that there might be a dual meaning of he's both insulting the church as plagiarists and saying that they're the idea of complacency and the idea of idleness and of laziness, of him saying that not only are these people in the church being like lazy and resting their laurels on these old works so that they can collect money, but they're also lazy and not rebelling against the larger forces in society. And he's kind of saying that a lot of these people who he's criticizing moderates in the way. He's criticizing the people who agree with Tillotsen by saying that, well, these people are lazy both in their unwillingness to stand up and fight for their rights against power, but also intellectually lazy. And if it seems like, these guys, sometimes you might read them, they might sound like they're so well spoken, they might seem like they're so well thought, but really, if you look into it, they're actually just plagiarized. Like they had one good writer and they're all just plagiarizing off of him, the last guy to have good ideas. So in reality, these people have nothing of worth mentioning. Does anyone else have any thoughts about how that relates to how to his writings in this and the dual purposes of these essays as both criticizing these institutions, but sometimes going back and forth and getting more than one? Does anyone else notice any other places where he did that? Have any thoughts on that?
That's an interesting connection. I think it's a deep thought. I think it might speak to how motivated Benjamin, Ben Franklin was about self-education and just individuality, you know, and having your own voice. And even though he was, you know, kind of using somebody else's voice here or something, you know, but yeah, it's an interesting thought that, and I think it's true, you know, people do portray themselves as being more like intellectual than they really are, because they're really kind of standing on the shoulders of somebody else, you know, and I think that's probably a valid thing, you know.
That's true, and especially so in like a traditionally conservative avenues like the church, in which you are very expressly building on the works and revering the works of the past, that might be even more driven towards that sense of standing on the shoulders of others. I see Josh, you have your hand up. What do you think on the matter?
Well, I actually was going to ask. I mean, would you say that all of this? I said this earlier in the chat. Would you say that this is a fight against censorship that he's doing? And you know, is this a fight against, you know, breaking that traditional mold, as you were describing earlier about, you know, going to Harvard and you know, do you feel as though he's trying to really, you know, make a statement here and really try to get people out of their narrow-mindedness, or do you believe that Benjamin Franklin is using this as an intention, or his intention is to write these letters to serve as a launching pad for his literary career?
I'd have to say there's certainly got to be two. Seems to be very morally driven. He's driven to start a school. He was driven to create. He's said to be, when the video we're watching, he's like one of the first. He ran the most, when he created his own newspaper, is one of the most popular in the 13 colonies. So he was kind of not the starter of printing these newspapers, but he was one of the progenitors of American newspapers. And I don't know the history of European newspapers, but there is a very real sense in which, well, nowadays we're living in the days of the internet. So this is like the newspapers are kind of like a dying breed. But I'm sure for our teacher, Mrs. Grote, and for others of their generation, they were all living, there's a great extent to which we're all living in Benjamin Franklin's world of creating the newspaper, creating the post office, which was the mail was a way of delivering newspapers and delivering thoughts and having free expression of ideas. So certainly it must have been very important. And you can see some of the idea of him needing to work around censorship. I mean, very literally, in that his brother would not publish what he had to say. He had to be this character. This is what I find so interesting about this, of these layers of criticism that are cloaked within metaphors that are cloaked. It's his fictional alternate ego's dream, her metaphorical dream. So let's talk about that for a minute. Does anyone have any thoughts in relation to censorship, with how this opinion of his in this piece is portrayed through the person through the woman, silent do-good, having a dream under an apple tree about the morality of these things? I see we have open my agenda, and today's quote of the day is a Benjamin Franklin quote. Lost time is never found again. It's a good one.
Was there any significance to the apple tree? I mean, is that just a random thing, or is that a religious reference?
You know, I took it as a religious reference. I thought of it as the tree of the Garden of Eden, of
Right.
the idea that when the people ate the fruit of the tree, they gained the ability to discern good from evil. So when you say, I actually wrote about this in my illusions thing, but when she says, I came to my usual place of retirement under the great apple tree, where she lays her head down and falls asleep and has all of these moral revelations, it definitely could be symbolic of the sitting under the apple tree is sitting in the shadow of the apple of knowledge from the Garden of Eden, and is related to man's ability to ascertain good from evil, which is what they got from the forbidden fruit. So in that way, when she is recollecting on the virtues and vices of the society, she is doing so while sitting in the shadows of the tree of knowledge. And as she says, given that she said in her first letter she was very prone to pointing out the virtues and vices of others, that it says that it was a place where it was her usual place of retirement, was in the shadow of the tree of knowledge.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
At least I thought. Does anyone else have any thoughts on the symbolism or the religious? I see from Justin. Yes, I too noticed that he masked his criticisms of the educational system as a dream that Silence Dogood has. I believe Franklin does this to stop his letters from being censored by the press, and some of his critiques went against the social norms of the time. Certainly. Certainly. And speaking of the censorship and the norms of the time, it might be a good time to look at his fifth letter responding to Mr. Ephraim Censorius, assuming that it is in fact his real name. Ephraim Censorius. It just sounds like the name of a censor.
Right.
So in this letter, he receives a letter from an angry reader desiring that you begin with your own sex, that he's saying that if you are going to be a woman speaking about these issues, you must first start with the issues of women. You must criticize the issues of women before you may criticize the issues of men. Does anyone have a thought on? Well, I'd actually start by just letting it open up to what people think about this second letter of his, true letter, of the response to this. Does anyone have any thoughts they'd like to share at the beginning?
This is probably one of my favorite letters, although I like letter 4 quite a bit. But this is probably one of my favorite letters because of the response she provides the man. It's almost like, I mean, she puts him in his place is how I look at it. By the time I'm done with the letter, I'm like, you go, it's like you told him, and she uses, I'm saying she because that's technically who it's supposed to be. She uses some logic in what she's saying, and I just think that in itself is just reflectant of Franklin's intelligence for the time. I mean, he's using a woman, an older aged woman, middle class, I mean, middle-aged woman with children, and has some experience, and she's obviously told us in her background that she had access to all these books and she spent a good amount of time reading these books, so we know she's educated, if you will, on her own. She did that just like Franklin, of course, but it just seems like she is way more intelligent in her response than the man sending the letter, expressing, you need, he's kind of trying to put her in her place. You're a woman and you have no right to speak of men's issues. And, she comes back and definitely lets him know that she's definitely qualified to speak of the issues. And again, puts him in her place. It puts him in his place.
I think that's very interesting. I definitely would agree with that. And I kind of thought of that back when we were talking earlier about why he chose to be a woman in the first place. And I was saying that it might evoke a different response from men of having a desire to put her in her place, which might have been, it's a trap. It's a very clear trap. He laid up, it was a layup for him. He knew what he wanted to say. But even so, that's another layer of complexity in his execution of, if he came out as a woman and immediately if the first thing he wrote as a woman was a letter complaining about men and how they're so viceful and how all of their things are unprovoked, it would totally come off as terrible. It would seem like she was a whiny, all the bad things you say, ungrateful, knows nothing. But when she sets it up in this scenario as putting herself out as fierce and intelligent and virtuous, and then lays a trap for someone to come along and criticize her in this way, now she can very openly clap back at him without having brought it up herself. She's set up a layup for herself. I guess to have a bit of controversial fun, what do y'all think of his opinion of it? Do you think that in every sin of idleness, let's see here, drunkenness, swearing, idleness, and pridefulness, are men in fact more at fault than women? And for the women's flaws, are the men yet also at fault for abiding them?
I think for the time period, yes.
Let's see here. Do you believe Silence Dogood might have directly injected phrases into contemporary vernacular or modern colloquialism? In my own personal opinion, I felt her fictional persona served as a catalyst for the propagation of ideas and language that resonates today. It definitely felt like Franklin's intelligence through a literary medium. I see Marquis says she agrees. Brandon says for the time period.
I for some reason I underlined, I believe there are more instances of extravagant pride to be found among men than among women. And yeah, I mean, yeah, probably. I mean, back then, and like we learned with the Salem witch trials, men's voices were more pronounced than women's, and so yeah, this is probably just kind of a continuation of that in that time that men got more of the credit than or tried to steal credit, or not steal but get credit than they would give to women. It's just not a very fair situation.
For sure. I see someone posted, in Christianity, Eve is blamed for giving Adam the apple. So that's another interesting thought from the biblical aspect of the tree representing knowledge, and her specifically being a woman who sits under it and critiques these people's morals. Even, like I said, I keep coming back to her name being Silence Dogood. Her name is Do Good. She's out here talking about the morals of people. So yeah. What do y'all think about him saying, are not the men to blame in their folly and maintaining us in idleness? Basically saying that if the women are in fault in some way, if the women are at fault in their idleness, why don't the men do anything about it? And if the men aren't doing anything, if there's something wrong and the men aren't doing anything about it, what right do they have to complain? Essentially, he says something like that. Here in the fifth one, I believe, looks to be about the fifth paragraph or so. But however, suppose we should grant for once that we are generally more idle than the men, without making any allowance for the weakness of the sex. I desire to know whose fault it is. Are not the men to blame for their folly in maintaining us in idleness? Who is there that can be handsomely supported in affluence, ease, and pleasure by another that will choose rather to earn his bread by the sweat of his own brow? And if a man will be so fond and so foolish as to labor hard himself for a livelihood, then suffer his wife in the meantime sit in ease and idleness, let him not blame her if she does so, for it is in a great measure his own fault. What do y'all think he might be trying to say about this situation, and how do y'all think that might relate to some of the other things he said about the church and about the defense of people's freedoms?
I think he was trying to sort of level the playing field, which is interesting because I mean he's a guy, but he's a kid, and so he had a lot of respect for women. It seems, and
No, yeah.
and so yeah, I think he was trying to, in this role, question men, and all of their virtues or whatever, which is interesting. Yeah, may have been part of the fun too.
I see Alex, you posted in the chat, gender roles are roles. Why act if you inherently can't define it? Could you say more on what you mean by that? Either
Yeah,
in chat.
yeah. I pretty much just feel it's like, yeah, gender roles are like, I don't know. Everybody has the idea, like we're seeing more of it nowadays, that gender roles don't have to be so binary. You know what I mean? Like people have viewpoints that don't fit into a binary gender role. You know what I mean? And so it's just, I don't know. I think he's pointing that out, that like, why decide that women are this and men are this if like, here I am, a man having these viewpoints, that a woman could agree with, you know what I mean, that are inherently true. It just shows that thoughts can't be like defined to a certain gender.
Yeah. I certainly think that's true. And though it probably would not have been a popular thing at the time, I see Melania says he was pointing out the hypocrisy. You can't be mad that women are idle when you're the ones forcing our idleness. Will you address the Polly Baker story? I will not. I have not actually read the Polly Baker story, I'm sorry to say. The speech of Polly Baker. When I went and I looked at it, it seemed to be a bunch of comments about the speech, but did not see the speech in and of itself.
Was that also a situation where he was doing, like, it was a woman's voice?
It looks like
Yeah, it was the same thing.
Yeah, it's the same kind of mentality, although he was older when he wrote this. But again, that one kind of relates to the letters in what we've been talking about just now, especially related to gender and the fact that Polly Baker, steps in front of the court and basically says, "Why do you keep punishing me for having children out of wedlock?"
Oh,
You know,
right.
the man that said, who asked me to be his wife, I gave my virginity to him, and then he took off. And so her argument is like, I'm providing, soldiers for the king. God says that women should, procreate. And so she's basically, it's a satirical piece. And it's basically making fun of the fact that, this double standard, she's getting in trouble. She's being fined. She's, has been removed from the church. She's all of these penalties that she's faced, and she doesn't understand why, because she's basically saying, the man had a part in all of this too. It wasn't just me. And I've been taking care of my kids on my own. I haven't asked anybody for money or assistance from the court or anything. But she's like, but you keep penalizing me and I can't afford that. And so by the end, she's basically saying, instead of penalizing me, you should erect a statue in my honor. Right. And so she's definitely poking fun of the double standards for the time. So that goes back to what you guys were saying, gender roles, and what Franklin was, trying to convey by using silence as the speaker of the letters and so forth. And he obviously recognizes the inequalities of gender roles during the time. And he's credited with supporting women's rights. And of course, he uses silence in the letters as a way to do that, because again, writing from a man's perspective, the audience he'd be writing to are men, right? And silence is trying to write for both. In this case, during the time, it was man and woman, right? Those were the genders. I realize were different in contemporary society related to that, but for the time, it was men and women. And Franklin felt that women deserved the same kind of rights that men deserved. And education was one of them, obviously. And, having a a life and not necessarily being defined by what the standards were, the stereotypical standards were for women of the time period. So it comes across a little bit more different with the middle-aged woman than a man making these kinds of comments, because we've discussed this earlier, that I think you said, Michael, that the Franklin was writing for both men and women, and so that it wasn't like, if it had been written by a man, like I said, it'd have been one-sided, right? One-sided. And Silence is trying to kind of bring in both genders and have them think about the content that she's presenting. So I just wanted to, draw your attention to that particular speech, because it's quite hilarious. Like, there's funny humor in these letters that Silence presents. It's quite humorous, especially like in the fifth letter, Michael, when you're talking about or I was the one that said that she basically puts the man in his place. She's using some humorous content to do that. It's subtle, and in some instances it's just blatant. The humor is blatant, and for the speech of Polly Baker, it is blatant. It's just at the end we're told, so her case was dismissed, and one of the magistrates from the court ended up marrying her, because she says, one of the men on your court is the one that said, I'm going to marry you, I love you. And so she gave herself to him, and yet he took off. And so at the end, it's funny. She's like, erect a statue in my honor. And the man ends up, the court, the magistrate from the court ends up marrying her. So it's hilarious. It's kind of funny when she puts it in black and white, that, it's not just me that's a part of creating these children, right? It's the man is involved too, and he deserves to be punished, if you will, in the same way you're punishing me.
Right. But
Yeah.
for some reason gets away with it.
I'm sorry?
But for some reason the man gets away with it.
Yes, exactly.
Low expectations. I see Julio has his hand raised.
Yeah, I think like all of this just covers the hypocrisy of the systems that were implemented,
Yeah.
against women, and that basically, like, they're victims of their own work, and she and she talks about like the men in the Polly speech, she talks about like men not marrying, okay, so what are women supposed to do? I mean, they're going to do what they got to do to provide, but yet again, these men aren't married, but yet they're having kids, and that's not going punished, it's going
I think
against
that's
the
definitely
church.
true. I think it's interesting also in relation to earlier of, we speak of hypocrisy, but Benjamin Franklin certainly seems to be a man who followed through with his beliefs, and that he spoke of the importance of education and of the issues at the colleges, and then he went on to make his own college where he believed he could address those things, and he spoke of the need to fiercely defend rights, and he stood up and participated in the revolution to support that. And that's something I kind of was talking about when I talked about him chastening the men for being idle and not rectifying the things of the women, in connection with the people in the church being idle and listening and obeying their directives instead of standing up for themselves. He certainly seems to have been a man who believed that if you saw an issue, you should stand up for it, and you should do anything necessary to pursue virtue and goodness, and to stand up for your morals, even if it meant lying about who you were and writing under a fake name, or rising up in a rebellion that ultimately leads to war.
Amen.
For real.
Yeah, I think he's just addressing the complacency in society,
Yeah. Calling people to action, stirring them to action.
Yeah, exactly.
I was also going to say earlier, I think there was an interesting kind of a double gender standard as well, where if earlier we were talking about or I was saying that if he'd come out pretending to be a woman and complained about these women's issues at the beginning, he would have been ridiculed as a woman. The woman would have been ridiculed as being complaining. But if he had come out forthright as a man, especially as a young man, and said all these same things that, hey, we should treat the women better, he probably would have been alternatively chastised as a man of being like, why are you not necessarily going to bat for them, but like, why are you so subservient to all of these women? Reminds me of Socrates. It does. It does remind me of Socrates as well. They're both people who live their beliefs.
So that gets back to your original question, is why he wrote as this role, is so that he could make these points and defend women. Like, it's I think that that we were kind of teasing that out, and that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Does anybody else have anything to say? I see it's about 10:15.
Not just that I definitely have a lot more respect for Ben Franklin now after reading these. I mean, I already did, but as Melanie said, advocate for women was not something that I was ever taught about him.
Oh yeah.
One of the things in the video that was, he was like 15 of 17 children, I think, and I wonder how that affected his view on self, making something of himself, on his own. I don't know, wow, he had a lot of brothers and sisters, a lot of siblings.
Yeah. Well, does anybody else have anything they'd like to say about it? Or Professor, anything you'd like to say to round this out?
I just want to, I'm like you guys, every time I learn something new about Benjamin Franklin, I've always liked him anyway. But I definitely have a lot of respect for him for several of the issues that he um, conveys through his writing, as Silence and as himself, as as he began publishing his paper and putting his own uh, using his name content in the paper. But yeah, he was definitely ahead of his time, especially at a very young age. We're talking 16 years old. If you read all the letters or even just the first 5 that you were assigned, the tone is very intellectual, uh philosophical, excuse me. It seems like, gosh, this guy, this boy, because that's what he was just a boy, was, well, I mean, his thoughts were, he was well educated, and he did that on his own by reading and so forth. And as we said earlier, there just, especially during the time, some ways where, or sometimes where, even today, college is not necessarily for everyone. That doesn't mean that you're stupid, right? It just means that you don't need college in order to, have a particular job. And so I know nowadays it's more like, why don't you go to college? If you don't go, you have no future. And I don't, that's not necessarily true. So I just, wanted to mention that. The other comment I wanted to mention was when you mentioned Harvard and the fact that he speaks, because he really speaks badly of Harvard and the kind of people that go in and that they come out, like you said, Brandon, blockheads. They're even more ignorant than they were when they went in, when they come out, right? But someone put this in your illusion exercise, I believe, that you mentioned that it's ironic that Harvard was the first university to give him an honorary degree, award him an honorary degree. And I thought that was a really good point, that, he spoke badly about them, yet they honored him with with a degree. So that's, kind of cool, or kind of interesting as well. I don't know what his reaction was. Well, was he alive when they honored him that? I don't remember if he was, because I was going to say, I'm not sure what his reaction might have been, or if it was awarded posthumously, so posthumously, I'm not sure. But I just found that interesting as well. This is probably one of my favorite authors that we read in here. Just, you're just reading a little bit about him, and I hopefully you read and watched videos and taught, they tell you a little bit more about his he was inventor as well. You know, it's just, this man was like the Renaissance man. He could write, he could invent, he could teach. I mean, it was amazing. He was an amazing man. Brandon, you have the last word.
Yeah, real quick, I was just gonna say, I looked it up and they gave the honorary degree from Harvard University in 1753, so he would
So
have
he
been
was alive.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So I don't know what his thoughts were about that, to be honest with you, you know, because he'd been poked so much fun at them. I wonder if he was, you know, honored or just like whatever, or, you know, I don't know. That'd be kind of interesting to find out.
Probably found it funny.
And you know what? You're right. He probably did find it funny. Here I am, you know, blasting your university. You're awarding me with a degree. That's yeah, it's pretty funny.
This was such a good discussion. I
I
literally
love,
made
yeah.
my cat sit at a window so he wouldn't bug me. Just to listen to this discussion. I was like, here's your birds. No, let me listen to this. It's
That's
good.
funny. Yeah, I love Franklin. Like I said, he's one of my favorites of out of the early American.
Yeah, I knew he was like from the beginning. I knew he was like a good guy. And I knew he was like pretty awesome, but I didn't know he was this awesome. I mean, like,
Yeah, he's pretty
this
awesome.
is something that they don't want to teach you in grade school. It's like, oh, Benjamin Franklin. They don't want to tell you that he was like he pretended to be a woman. That's not something that nobody wants to
Yeah,
know.
silence do good letters are not something that are usually taught in the public school system.
There's a
You know,
lot of
usually
things
his
that I think I
Poor
learned
Man's
too.
Almanac. Poor Man's Almanac is what's usually taught about Benjamin Franklin.
Mhm.
And then
I think
his,
there's a lot of things that I've learned in this class that I should have learned when I was a kid that wasn't taught. And I think that's one of the things is like, I think college, yeah, it's not for everybody, but it does teach you a lot of the things that people wanted to hide
oh, sure.
in high
Oh,
school
sure.
and middle school.
Sure. Yeah, I don't deny that. Well, we are at the end of class. We're 1 minute after. I've already called the roll, so I know who is here. I've greatly enjoyed the discussion for today. Michael, you did a great job on your own. And so I'm going to wish you to have a good rest of your day, and I will see you on Thursday.
Thank you all so much. Hope
Thank
you all
you.
have a wonderful couple days. See y'all around.
Hey, you too. See you
Get
later.
those Benjamins.
Bye. Have a good day.
Bye.
Have you ever thought about like, I know they're like definitely in a whole different time frame than us, but like the way that these people write, like how it would be like to have to listen to like grade their assignments, like if they were in your class, because I feel like it would be interesting.
Well, I've read so much from the past that I don't even think twice when I read it. I can read the words, you know, easily, but I've you know, years
Yeah.
reading certain kinds of material from the past that where words are spelled the way he spells them and punctuated the way that he had punctuated. So I just read it kind of in a natural way.
Mhm.
It's not difficult, you know, because I've read it so many times.
I just think like sometimes like the topic kind of like goes on like a weird like squiggly lines, like they don't really know what they're even talking about. I'm like, what is this conversation that we're having? Because they talk about some weird things in the past.
They talk about related to what was going on during the time.
And sometimes in their imagination.
True. True.
Yeah. Thank you for class.
Oh, thank you. Have a good day.
You too. Bye.
See you later.
You have a
Anyone
good day,
else?
Professor.
Thank you, Jaren. You too. Bye. Matthew, any questions?